Hey everybody, tonight's video is called The Sword of God's Judgment, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Ezekiel, where we're going to be looking at the sword of God's judgment. And we often hear in the Old Testament about the sword of God's judgment. So in Ezekiel chapter 5, we're going to see Ezekiel's words, inspired by God, of course. And Ezekiel 5 verse 1 through 4 starts out, "And you, son of man, take a sharp sword, take it as a barber's razor, and pass it over your head and your beard, and take scales to weigh, and divide the hair. You shall burn with fire 1/3 in the midst of the city. When the days of the siege are finished, then you shall take 1/3 and strike it around it with the sword, and 1/3 you shall scatter in the wind. I will draw out a sword after them. You shall also take a small number of them and bind them in the edge of your garment. Then take some of them again and throw them into the midst of the fire and burn them in the fire. From there a fire will go out into all the house of Israel." So we see the sign here moves into the sign of shaving his hair. And that's to illustrate severe humiliation to come at the hand of the enemies. And for a man at this time period to have their beard touched or their hair cut would be a big disgrace. And it emphasizes calamities to 3 segments of Jerusalem due to the Babylonian conquest. And some were punished by fire, pestilence, famine, and others died by the enemy's sword. And some were dispersed and pursued by death. And a small part of his hair clinging to his garments depicted a remaining remnant, some of whom were subject to further calamity. And cutting facial hair was symbolic for loss of manhood, as seen in 2 Samuel chapter 10 verse 4 and 5, Isaiah 7 verse 20, and Isaiah 50 verse 6. And just like the Assyrians, the Babylonians used the cutting of the hair or the shaving of the beard as means of humiliating captive soldiers, so like POWs. And the careful weighing and dividing of the hair suggests that God had carefully measured judgment on his own people. And sword isn't usually used to cut hair. I don't know about you, but I've never gave myself a haircut with a sword. It kind of freaks me out. But a sword is used for battle. And in verse 2, I'm going to reread it. It says, "You shall burn with fire 1/3 in the midst of the city when the days of the siege are finished, and then you shall take 1/3 and strike around it with the sword, and 1/3 you shall scatter in the wind. I will draw out a sword after them." So many theologians believe verse 2, "in the midst of the city," was actually the clay tablet that Ezekiel made with the drawing of Jerusalem on it that we saw back in chapter 1 verse 4. And Ezekiel was also to attach a few hairs to the hem of his clothing and burn a few more in a fire. And this spoke of the small remnant left behind and the suffering that they would face. In verse 5 and 6 it says, "Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the midst of the nations, and have in the countries all around her. She has rebelled against my judgments by doing wickedness more than the nations, and against my statutes more than the countries that are all around her. For they have refused my judgments, and they have not walked in my statutes." So here the great city alone wasn't meant, but was used as a representative of the whole land, which, despite its strategic opportunity and responsibility, rejected God. And Jerusalem should have honored and submitted to the Lord, but more rebellious and wicked were they than the pagan nations. In verse 7, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God, because you have multiplied disobedience more than the nations that are all around you, have not walked in my statutes, nor kept my judgments, nor even done according to the judgments of the nations that are all around you." So instead of being witnesses to the heathen nations Israel had exceeded them in idolatrous practices. And the nations maintained their familiar idols, while Israel defected from their true and living God. And God's people were worse than the pagans in proportion to spiritual knowledge and privileges. And the judgments of God are always relative to light and privilege granted. And since Ezekiel's people were unique in their disobedience, they were to be outstanding in their punishment. In verse 8 through 10, therefore, thus says the Lord God, Indeed, I am against you, and will execute judgments in your midst, in the sight of the nations. And I will do among you what I have never done, and the like of which I will never do again, because of all your abominations. Therefore fathers shall eat their sons in your midst, and sons shall eat their fathers, and I will execute judgments among you, and all of you who remain I will scatter to all the winds. So you have to go back to our kickoff of this year in the book of Lamentations, which reveals how literally these promises were realized when parents ate their children and sons ate their fathers in the times of starvation. And down through the centuries had come the threats of Leviticus 26:29 and Deuteronomy 28 verse 53, taken up by Jeremiah, as seen in Jeremiah chapter 19 verse 9, and Lamentations 2 verse 22, and Lamentations 4 verse 10, and sailed in the life of the disobedient nation. And even the remnant would be scattered and suffer. And when we hear the Lord say, even I am against you, that should be something that creates fear. It's a terrifying declaration, for even I, the Lord, am against you. In verse 11, therefore, as I live, says the Lord God, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things and with all your abominations, therefore I will also diminish you. My eye will not spare, nor will I have any pity. So here was a solemn oath pledging the very existence of God for the fulfillment of the prophecy. And as I live is found 14 times in this book. And their greatest sin was defiling the sanctuary, showing the height of their wickedness. And in verse 6, God said their sins against him were worse than those of the pagan nations, and God would diminish them as they had defiled his sanctuary. In verse 12, 1/3 of you shall die of the pestilence and be consumed with famine in your midst, and 1/3 shall fall by the sword all around you. And I will scatter another third to all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. So the four well-known judgments of pestilence, sword, famine, and scattering were their judgment. And they had no place to offer atoning blood, therefore the barren their sins without relief. And as in a demonstration with the sword cut here in verse 2, 1/3 would face the judgment directly. In verse 13 through 15, thus shall my anger be spent, and I will cause my fury to rest upon them, and I will be avenged, and they shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it in my zeal, when I have spent my fury upon them. Moreover, I will make you waste in a reproach among the nations that are all around you, in the sight of all who pass by. So it shall be a reproach, a taunt, a lesson, and astonishment to the nations that are all around you, when I execute judgments among you in anger and in fury and in furious rebukes. I, the Lord, have spoken. So Ezekiel, the prophet's purpose was to impress Israel's conscience of God's intense hatred of idolatry and apostasy. And fury and anger are repeated here 6 times. And God's fury built up a long time against his wicked and rebellious people. And when the time was right, in the near future, it would be spent and it would rest upon them. And God would accomplish his purpose of teaching the nations through the judgments of Israel. And obedience would show the nations that were blessed. And covenant blessings, God would teach the nations through his judgment upon his people. In verse 16, it says, "And when I send against them the terrible arrows of famine, which shall be for destruction, which I will send to destroy you, I will increase the famine upon you and cut off your supply of bread." So the evil arrows included hail, rain, mice, locusts, and mildew, as seen in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 23 through 24. And the last verse of the chapter says, "So I will send against you famine and wild beasts, and they will bereave you. Pestilence and blood shall pass through you, and I will bring the sword against you. I, the Lord, have spoken." So God's personal signature was on their doom. And the judgment would come as promised, and it would come in many different ways, we see. And Ezekiel prophesied this back in 593 BC, and going forward would see it fulfilled in 586 BC. So tonight we're going to wrap up real quick here. We look at the prophecy acted out of the thirds with the cutting of Ezekiel's hair. And when you see the writings of 1/3 of this, 1/3 of that, it might remind you of the book of Revelation. In verse 5 through 10, it showed us the promise of severe judgment against Jerusalem. In verse 11 and 12, move into the application of the prophecy of the thirds with the judgment on Jerusalem by thirds. In verse 13, 14 is the spending out of God's anger. And the chapter ends with the great destruction of God's judgment. And that's going to wrap up our study for tonight. We'll see you back on Saturday as we'll look at the judgment and the restoration from idolatry. So I hope you have a great rest of your week ahead. God bless, and we'll see you this weekend.